commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Syrskyi, has announced that 90% of the city of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region is now back under Ukrainian control. We saw Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the entrance to the city shooting a selfie-style video in front of the city's sign, Stele there. So a few days ago. So are we actually seeing with this small counteroffensive by the Ukrainian armed forces a culmination of the Russian army, at least in this phase of the war? So Privit, I'm standing here outside the Odessa Opera House once again. It is a very cold evening. Well, it's not quite evening, we're about to hit evening. As you can see, there's a lot of fog around. That is indicative of the conditions in Ukraine over the last few weeks, and that has meant that we have seen a few changes of position. You probably heard about Pokrovsk-Mirhad agglomeration, and that Russia's taken some of that territory, that urban space, and you've seen Russian propagandists like Solovyov in what looked like the center of Pokrovsk with a flag, at least doing a video, and then probably having to scurry off. The reason that they can shoot those videos is because of this fog behind me, because when it's not foggy and it's clear, then FPV drones can come and basically blow you up if you were standing that close to the line of contact. However, when it's foggy like this, it does allow groups of people to move forward without as big a risk of being hit by FPV drones. And that is different to what we've seen in previous winter seasons, at least the beginning of the winter, where normally there isn't so much fighting. It's actually normally a period where there's a lot of fighting. Because of the ground here, it's been quite damp, and as a result, it's very hard to move off-road. You basically are stuck on the roads. When it gets really cold, then everything hardens a bit more. It actually makes it easier to launch offensives. So this year has been different, and we've seen a huge amount of fighting over the last few weeks. So the conditions and the evolution of war have played a role. However, it is in large part determined by the geopolitical situation, in particular Donald Trump doing his best almost on a daily basis at the moment to bully Ukraine into capitulation to Russia by signing a deal. He doesn't seem too worried about what kind of deal it is. And in order to ratchet up the pressure on the US, on Ukraine, on Ukraine's European allies, Russia has been trying to give this image of making inevitable progress on the battlefield. Not that they have taken anything of great significance in the last few years, in effect, in this Russo-Ukrainian war. In the last year, they've taken less than 1% of Ukraine's territory, and then you've got to size up how strategic is this territory. If you take some empty farmland, is that really strategic? Not at all. If you take a particularly important town, then you could argue that Pokrovsk has some significance, maybe on an operational basis, but really to have strategic value, they would need to be taking the entire fortress belt and rolling back the Ukrainian forces towards the river Dnipro in the center of the country. And they seem a long way away from that, and they seem, at least in a military sense, with their current manpower, materiel, and money situation, at the moment, not to have the resources in order to be able to achieve that. Hence why I've seen so much discussion over the last few weeks about Ukraine withdrawing from all of Donbass, all of Donetsk, all those defensive positions. The estimate is that it would take, at the current rate of progress, Russia 2 to 3 years and hundreds of thousands of more casualties, so KIA and WIA, MIA, in order to achieve that goal. So that is why they are trying to achieve it diplomatically, and then of course as soon as they've gone past that fortress belt, they can restart the war, whether that's a few weeks afterwards or a few years afterwards. So that we would have to find out that in due course if that were the case. I don't see any reason to think that Ukraine will sign such a deal at the moment. In particular, this recapture of Kupiansk. Also need to remember that Vladimir Putin had awarded a medal to the Russian commander for having captured, inverted commas, the city. It was only a few weeks ago. So the fact that it's been reversed so quickly, along with another Russian advance that was north of Pokrovsk, maybe it was back in August, just before Vladimir Putin was welcomed by the US president. The red carpet was rolled out for him in Alaska, and it didn't seem like the US got very much from that particular summit. But Just before that, Russia also made a big advance that was then turned back by the Ukrainian forces, and those troops were eventually eliminated or captured, or some of them, I'm sure, managed to get back to Russian lines. However, they lost that territory within, I think it was within a few weeks, about a month of fighting. So this is a trend that we've been seeing. Yes, Russia is making some progress in Pokrovsk, Minorhad. However, it is extremely slow. They have been outside that city for, well, it's at least 15 months at this stage, and it was expected to have fallen already this time last year. So a year on, it's possible it will be captured by Russia, but for how long can they keep it is also not clear, since what we've seen in Kupiansk. So what does this all mean? Does it mean that Russia is about to culminate, which means they will not have the resources to push much further? Maybe after they've finally managed to seize Pokrovsk and Minorhad together, would they actually have the resources to go any further? Interestingly, when I shot a live stream, I guess it was last weekend, on my lifestyle channel, there were lots of what looked like trolling Russian comments. One said, you need to go watch this video from the Duran, which is like basically a big pro-Russian geopolitics channel, because they interview so many interesting people. So I asked, which video do you want me to watch? So I was sent a video, I watched it, and the only point that I could take out of the video that was of any value to me was, it was very clear that they were particularly concerned. They claimed that the Western European leaders, so Germany, France, the UK, they have intel that the Russian military is in fact about to culminate, and that is why they don't see any reason for Ukraine to make these dramatic concessions, which would basically amount to a medium to long-term capitulation and surrender of the country to Russia, because they think that Russia is about to run out of the resources necessary in order to continue its advances. So that is very interesting that that is what they see. Of course, they're going to take measures to frame everything as being the opposite, to try and undermine that belief that it's about to happen presumably in the short term sometime. However, when we look at the battlefield and how little progress Russia has been able to make over really the last 3 years, we'll say since the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, summer 2023, made very little progress. Russia's basically been inching forward all the time, but they've taken so little territory at such a huge cost, and it does not look like they have the capacity to go much further unless they take very dramatic decisions internally in Russia. The main one is going for another mobilization. They had a mobilization back in autumn 2022 where they took in 300,000 people who were compelled to go to the military. Since then, they've just paid huge salaries to get Russians to voluntarily go and come here and try and kill Ukrainians and destroy their country. However, with the economic situation, Russia is now in a recession, and it looks particularly bleak as we go into 2026. Even though they went to India to try and sell some stuff to get some money, like I think it was a nuclear submarine, they may not have the finances to keep this war going much longer without going to a general mobilization. And if they have to do that, then it's very hard to know if the support for the current regime in Moscow, for Vladimir Putin, will continue, because then presumably people will be forced to go in larger numbers, and they may start to question why the country is in such a mess when for a quarter century it's been ruled by one man in effect, Vladimir Putin, and the cabal around him. So this is a very strong signal, this recapture of Kupiansk. And there's still some Russian forces in the city. It's like 10% of the city is still controlled by Russians. However, they are cut off to the north from the rest of the Russian forces by the river. I think Oskil is the name. So they are almost certainly going to be captured or eliminated in the coming week or two. This is a huge signal that Russia does not have the capacity to take much more territory in Ukraine, especially in Donbass, than they are maybe after Pokrovsk and Minorhad if they manage to get there, and that in fact could be the culmination of the Russian military. What does this mean for the trajectory of the war? Well, if Ukraine today, there's a big meeting in Brussels, if they get the financing from those in the form of a loan backed by those frozen Russian assets, and they don't agree to any sort of capitulation compromise that Donald Trump is trying to negotiate, or he's embassies are trying to negotiate on behalf of Russia. Then going into 2026, the situation will become less propitious for the Russian side. They have elections that are problematic coming up for Russia. They are in a recession. They are, as I discussed today, likely to reach a culmination, have to make very difficult decisions for the current Putin regime to stay popular or popular enough to remain in power. And it is all coming to a head. We've got Viktor Orban is in trouble politically in Hungary. It's not clear that he will be able to win elections that have to take place by April 2026. And then we got the US midterms coming up in late 2026. And the primaries for those take place normally in the spring and the summer, depending which part of the US it is. And Donald Trump's popularity rating is extremely low. And it's not looking good for the Republican Party. If we look at the polls, supporting Ukraine is popular not just amongst majority Americans, but a majority of Republicans, people identify as Republicans. And Donald Trump has a very low popularity rating. It's basically non-existent for independents and Democrats. Well, Democrats you'd expect, but also very low amongst, relatively low amongst Republican voters. So all that indicates, and there are many Republicans on the Hill who are not very happy with his policy with Russia and Ukraine. So all that points towards a better 2026 for Ukraine and a worse 2026 for Vladimir Putin than it's been in 2025 and 2024. So big signal. Let me know what you think down in the comments, whether in a military sense Russia is maybe not in a lot of trouble. They're not about to collapse all their lines, but it looks like they're losing the capacity to push forward in Ukraine, which has been one of their main talking points about the inevitability, from their point of view, of a Russian victory militarily in Ukraine. And back tomorrow, maybe even later tonight if I have electricity in my apartment again. Did get back electricity yesterday, but it is not on all the time. We still have blackouts. When we hear the results of the meetings in Brussels today on those frozen Russian assets and the financing of Ukraine going forward, because Donald Trump's administration doesn't give any money to Ukraine to help them sustain their country at the moment. So, do побачення, гарного вечора, слава Україні.